Sometime in the middle of the night, a clock stopped inside the Creech household. Nobody had let the spring wind down, and nobody had touched the gears. Yet a mechanism with 8 days of power left in it simply quit at an hour when the entire house was asleep. By the time the sun finally cleared the ridgeline, Aldous Creech was found dead in his bed. This was not the first time a life had ended alongside a ticking hand. In the span of 14 months, the same thing had happened 4 times before, and every single clock that stopped had been built by the same man. His name was Elias Vane, a 52-year-old craftsman who lived on the edge of town, and the people of Harlan Hollow were beginning to ask a question they couldn't shake loose. They needed to know if his clocks were merely predicting these deaths, or if the machines were actually causing them. Harlan Hollow sits in eastern Kentucky, within a narrow cut between 2 steep ridgelines, the kind of valley where the sun arrives late and leaves early, and the road in is the same road out. Back in 1883, the settlement held about 200 souls, 1 Baptist church, a mill, and a post office, with enough mountain between it and the county seat that the people mostly handled their own affairs. The congregation served as more than just a Sunday institution, because it was the social architecture of the entire place. You were known through that church and judged through it, and if something went wrong in the hollow, it was the congregation that decided how to fix it. Elias Vane had been living in the hollow since about 1871. He was not a local man, and nobody seemed entirely sure where he had come from, which, in a place like this, was its own kind of problem. He had arrived with a set of tools and a few references, but no family to speak of, and he set up his shop in a low-ceilinged building on the south end of the main road. Over the next decade, he became the only clockmaker most people in the valley had ever dealt with directly. The shop always smelled of machine oil and fresh sawdust and the faint mineral bite of metal shavings. Every wall was covered in clocks that were constantly running and perfectly accurate, which was a service that carried real weight in a mountain settlement with no other way to check the time. Farmers used his work to track the seasons, and the church used his work to time the bells, while families saved for months to buy a piece for the front parlor where every visitor could see it. Vane worked long hours and spoke in short sentences, and while he was not exactly hostile to his neighbors, he just did not seem to require their company. There was no Bible visible anywhere in his shop, which the neighbors certainly noticed, and he never attended a single Sunday service. People saw these things and remembered them, but nobody pressed him directly because his work was too good, and he kept to himself in a way that made confrontation feel unnecessary. He measured time with a precision that his neighbors found slightly unnerving, and he owned at least 4 pocket watches that he would check mid-conversation, without ever explaining why. The town did not like him, but they used him, and in a small settlement dependent on one road, that is often how tolerance works. You accommodate what you cannot replace. What nobody in Harlan Hollow fully understood was that Vane's relationship to time went considerably deeper than his trade. He had studied things that did not have any obvious application to making clocks for Baptist families in the Kentucky mountains. If you looked at the machines he built closely enough, you would see they were not quite what they appeared to be from across a parlor. That is where the story actually starts, not with the deaths or the fear, but with the machines themselves and what Vane had hidden inside them. A Vane clock didn't look like anything else you could find in eastern Kentucky back in the 1880s. Most clockmakers working the rural markets in those days were just assembling movements from imported parts, fitting them into plain wooden cases, and selling function over form. Vane was different because he cut his own gears by hand from brass stock, using files and a small lathe he had brought with him from wherever he lived before he arrived in the hollow. The tolerances on these machines were tighter than they ever needed to be for a simple timepiece. The teeth on the escape wheel were ground to a sharpness that a master watchmaker in Philadelphia would have recognized and respected. And while most of Vane's customers couldn't have described that technical skill, they could somehow feel it in the way the clock sounded. There was a specific quality to the tick, a regularity that went slightly beyond mechanical necessity and felt like it had a sense of intention. The cases were mostly walnut, though he used cherry for some, and he jointed every piece himself before fitting the glass and turning the finials on a small foot-powered lathe set up against the back wall of his shop. If you got close enough to examine the back of the case, specifically the interior panel that nobody ever saw once the clock was hung on a wall, you would find symbols etched deep into the wood. These were not decorative flourishes or artistic choices, but deliberate marks in a notation that did not correspond to anything in standard clockmaking practice. Hargrove's record, which is the one that survived long enough to reach the university archive, describes them as characters of unknown purpose that were cut with evident care. A few of these marks have been reproduced in archive photographs, but to this day, nobody has been able to identify the system they belong to. He sold his work exclusively to members of the congregation, a detail we know from the sales ledger recovered from his shop at the time of his arrest. That ledger survives only in fragments, but it is legible enough to establish a very clear pattern of who was allowed to buy his machines. He did not sell to travelers or people just passing through the area, as every single clock went to a family that attended the Baptist church on the north end of the hollow. The prices he charged were high enough that owning one of these clocks actually meant something to the neighbors. These were parlor clocks, displayed in the front rooms where visitors would be sure to see them, serving as status objects in a community where your standing was mostly measured by land, livestock, and church attendance. Having a Vane clock on your mantelpiece said something specific about who you were in the hollow. These were weight-driven movements, and that technical detail matters immensely for everything that happened later. A weight-driven clock of this specific design should run for 8 days between windings on a full drop, and under normal conditions in a well-maintained house, they simply do not stop. Springs can fatigue over time, and pendulums can be bumped by a passing child, but a properly wound, weight-driven clock with a functioning escapement keeps running until the weight hits the bottom, or someone physically stops it. The first documented instance of a clock stopping happened in March of 1882. The clock belonged to the household of Reverend Mott, a tall case piece the Reverend had bought from Vane 2 years earlier and kept in the front room near the window. It stopped at 2:14 in the morning on a Tuesday, while everyone in the Mott house was asleep, and nobody had touched the cabinet. The weight still had several days of drop remaining, meaning there was no mechanical reason for the gears to seize. Mott's wife was found dead that same morning, cold in her bed, at an hour the family later estimated to be somewhere around 2 o'clock. Nobody connected those two facts immediately, because people didn't look for patterns in their tragedies yet. A clock stops and a woman dies, and in a mountain hollow in 1882, that sequence just looks like grief and coincidence and the ordinary cruelty of a hard winter. It took several more deaths for the math to start feeling like something other than a series of accidents. The second stopping came 7 months later, in October of 1882, involving a farmer named Thomas Gillis, who lived on the east side of the hollow. Gillis owned a Vane clock he had purchased in 1879 and kept on a shelf in the main room of his house, and his daughter found it stopped one morning when she came down to start the fire. Her father was already gone by then, having died sometime in the night from what the family described as his heart simply giving out. He was 61 years old and had been in poor health for quite some time, so in a hollow that handled its own medicine, nobody thought to file a report or send for a doctor. They buried him in the churchyard, and they grieved, and they moved on with their lives. The detail about the clock only came out later during a church meeting, which is when people started comparing what they remembered about those quiet nights. In February of 1883, a woman named Cecilia Pratt died in her sleep at the age of 73. She was the oldest member of the congregation, and her death by itself would have surprised no one in the community. What her son mentioned quietly to 2 men from the church who came to help with the burial preparations was that the clock in the front room had stopped the very night she died. He had noticed the silence when he came downstairs at dawn, and because it was a Vane clock he had bought for his mother as a gift years earlier, he knew the weight was still loaded. He rewound it himself, and the gears started moving again without any trouble, which actually made the failure harder to explain rather than easier. The fourth death was Jonas Whitley, a deacon's son who was only 26 years old when he died from a fever in April of 1883. His clock stopped that same night, and his mother told 2 neighbors about the coincidence before the week was even out. And then came the death of Aldous Creech in the autumn of 1883, which is the moment where this story first opened. That made 5 deaths and 5 stopped clocks, with every single clock built by the same man. The congregation didn't need a formal document to tell them something was wrong, because the pattern was assembling itself in plain sight, passed from mouth to mouth across a valley where everyone knew the furniture in everyone else's front room. The formal reckoning finally happened at a church meeting in late November of 1883. Deacon Silas Hargrove was the one who called the meeting, and he arrived at the church prepared for a confrontation. He had spent the weeks beforehand going from house to house to talk to the families, asking specific questions about when the clocks stopped, what time the hands showed, and how much weight was left on the cord. He wrote every detail down in a record book that he kept tucked in his coat pocket, refusing to let anyone else hold it. And that record is the only reason we have any precise information about this case today. What Hargrove assembled was a table of names and dates. He listed the name of the deceased, the date of their death, and the estimated time of passing whenever the family could provide it. He included the name of the clock's owner and a final column he labeled simply "stopped," where he marked a yes or a no. Every single entry in that final column read yes. Vane was summoned to the church to answer for these coincidences. He wasn't arrested yet, but he was asked to stand and explain himself to the people who had bought his work. He came to the meeting and stood at the front of the room, listening quietly as Hargrove read the table aloud to the neighbors. When Hargrove finished, Vane told the room that weight-driven clocks stopped for all sorts of reasons that had nothing to do with the people sleeping near them. He mentioned mainspring fatigue, which isn't even a factor in a weight-driven movement, suggesting he was either confused or simply didn't care about the accuracy of his defense. He also mentioned temperature variations causing changes in the thickness of the oil, which is a real scientific phenomenon, but the congregation found it completely unconvincing given the timing of the deaths. He never raised his voice, and he never denied that the clocks had stopped. He just kept offering explanations that were technically grounded but emotionally useless, acting like a man who had decided the truth either couldn't be proven or wouldn't be believed by his neighbors. The congregation listened to him, and when he was done speaking, they didn't accept a word of it. The question they kept returning to wasn't whether Vane's mechanical explanations were accurate, but whether Vane already knew exactly what his clocks would do before he ever sold them. Nobody in Harlan Hollow could say where Elias Vane had come from before he arrived in their midst, but his arrest finally gave the townspeople a reason to step inside his shop. What they found among the gears and glass told a partial story of a man who was far more than a simple mountain mechanic. He had been trained in Philadelphia, a fact established by the references he carried into the Hollow back in 1871, which consisted of letters from 2 respected city clockmakers. These men vouched for his technical skill and his steady character, yet they remained curiously silent about his personal history or why he was leaving the city. Before those years in Philadelphia, he spent a 2 or 3 year period in Cincinnati, working in a repair shop on the west side. But he left that life behind without a word of explanation. He arrived in Kentucky, carrying only his tools and his books, choosing a remote mountain hollow over a city where his specialized skills would have earned him a much more comfortable living. The books he kept tell us the most about his private mind. After the arrest, the circuit constable and 2 men from the church went through the shop to catalog the items sitting on the shelves above Vane's workbench. They found the expected technical manuals and gear ratio tables, including a worn copy of Saunier's famous treatise on watchmaking that Vane had covered in dense, handwritten notes. There were other volumes, however, that had no business being in a clockmaker's shop in the 1880s. He owned a text on acoustic theory and 2 books on mechanical vibration, one of which was a German volume that no one in the hollow was able to read. Most intriguing was a handwritten notebook, kept separate from his business ledger, which was filled with calculations the constable described as figures of an unknown purpose relating to intervals and cycles. That notebook was never entered into evidence during his trial, and its location today remains a mystery. When you look at those books together, they suggest that Vane was obsessed with how mechanical systems react to the world around them. Vibration theory deals with how objects respond to invisible forces, and how a specific frequency can destabilize a machine that looks perfectly solid to the eye. A pendulum clock is essentially a resonance machine that relies on a precise, rhythmic cycle to function, and that cycle is incredibly sensitive to any interference from outside the wooden case. The physical evidence points toward a theory that I want to state plainly, because while it explains the mechanics of the tragedy, it doesn't quite explain the soul of it. Vane may have built a deliberate, calibrated fault into the escapement of every clock he sold to the people of the Hollow. This wasn't a crude defect that would make the clock break down immediately, but rather a sensitive instability designed to stall the mechanism under very specific environmental conditions. In the Kentucky mountains, the late winter and early spring bring a brutal mix of plunging temperatures and rising humidity as the cold air rolls off the ridges and moisture clings to the creek bottoms. This specific climate shift changes how lubricants behave in precision machinery, and a man who had studied vibration theory would know exactly how to predict those failures. It is also a grim fact of mountain life that late winter and early spring is when the elderly pass away most frequently. The combination of freezing nights, damp air, and the heavy smoke from wood stoves in poorly ventilated cabins often pushes worn-out bodies past their breaking point. The overlap between the conditions that stop a poorly lubricated clock and the conditions that kill a sick person in a cold house is a very real statistical reality. That correlation explains the general pattern of the deaths, but it fails to explain the terrifying precision of the events. The Mott clock stopped at 2:14 in the morning, and Margaret Mott was found cold in her bed at almost exactly 2 o'clock that same night. This wasn't a matter of the same week, or even the same day, but the very same hour. That level of coincidence goes far beyond what temperature or humidity can explain, and anyone who tries to tell you otherwise is just trying to make a messy story feel more logical than it actually was. Whatever Vane believed he was doing, or whatever he thought his clocks were measuring, is a secret he took to his grave. His personal journals were never recovered by the authorities, and he answered every official question with a mix of technical jargon and cold silence. He eventually died 18 months into a 5-year sentence in a prison cell in Frankfurt, leaving the truth behind. The people of Harlan Hollow didn't wait for a confession or a scientific explanation. They had already stopped wondering what Vane knew and started deciding what they were going to do to stop him. The first window in Vane's shop was smashed out in the early days of December in 1883. No one admitted to seeing the vandal, so Vane simply swept up the glass himself and refused to report the incident to the local constable. A week later, a second window was shattered, but this time, the attacker had pressed a written note into the putty of the frame before breaking the glass. While the note itself is lost to history, the records kept by a man named Hargrove describe the writing as a warning of Christian obligation. This suggests the local congregation had moved past private gossip and into the territory of public threats, which is usually where these stories take a dark turn. 2 men, identified in the records only by their initials, confronted Vane on the road as he walked home in mid-December. The account of the meeting is brief and reads more like a private note than a formal statement, but it confirms the encounter turned violent. Vane was struck at least once across the face, yet he reportedly turned and walked back to his shop without saying a word or fighting back. He never filed a complaint because doing so would have required a long ride to the county seat to explain to an officer why a clockmaker's face was bruised, and no one in the hollow was interested in helping him. During this same time, Hargrove began changing the way he kept his records. His original table of deaths and stopped clocks had been a simple document of observation, but the circular he produced in December was a piece of propaganda. He wrote out a list of the dead by name and placed it directly alongside the clocks they had owned, adding a summary at the bottom regarding what he called the pattern of interference. He made sure to distribute copies to every family in the church who had a Vane clock ticking on their wall. You can imagine the fear of a father sitting by the fire and reading his own family name on a list that ended with a row of corpses. The circuit preacher arrived for his quarterly visit during the second week of December and delivered a sermon that drew a massive crowd to the Baptist church. He never mentioned Vane by name, but he didn't have to, because everyone in the pews knew exactly who he was talking about. He spoke of craftsmen who work in the shadows, and the sin of trying to measure things that belong only to God, calling Vane a man who sells time and steals life. That specific phrase, sells time and steals life, became a mantra in the hollow that survived long after the sermon was over. Vane was finally arrested on the 14th of January in 1884. The official charge in the county ledger was malicious mischief and suspected conjuration, which was based on an old Kentucky law that had been considered an obsolete relic for over 20 years. The constable who made the arrest had ridden in from the county seat, and the fact that he brought 2 prominent members of the congregation as his witnesses shows that the whole affair had been carefully orchestrated behind closed doors. The men found Vane sitting quietly at his workbench in the back of the shop. He was working on a half-finished clock movement, with the brass plates laid open and the gears sorted by size on a clean cloth. But the escapement had not yet been installed. He was using a small file when the men walked through the door, and he simply set the tool down and looked at the constable without uttering a single word. He offered no resistance and asked no questions as they took him into custody. He simply put on his heavy coat and walked out into the cold, leaving the unfinished clock on the bench, with the gears still sitting in their neat, sorted rows. The shop was supposed to be locked after the arrest, but the door wasn't secured immediately. Several townspeople slipped inside during the days before the constable returned, and it is almost certain that they took items from the shelves. We don't know what was stolen or where those objects ended up, which remains one of the most frustrating gaps in the historical record. When the official inventory was finally taken, the constable found only the tools, the ledger, and a few unfinished projects. The walls of the shop were completely bare, and every finished clock that had been ticking in that room for 12 years had vanished into the night. The trial lasted 2 days, and that is not a summary of the proceedings, but the entirety of them. 2 days in the Harlan County Courthouse in February of 1884 resulted in a verdict that sent Elias Vane away from the hollow forever. What survives of the trial record is partial in a way that feels less like the natural decay of an archive and more like a deliberate act of selective preservation. The prosecution's opening statement remains, copied in a clerk's steady hand onto 3 pages, and the final verdict sits there as a single, cold paragraph. Everything in between, the testimony of the neighbors, the witness examinations, whatever defense was mounted, and whatever Vane himself said or refused to say, is entirely absent from the file. Whether those pages were lost in the courthouse fire of 1897, removed by a hand that didn't want them read, or never properly filed to begin with, is a question no one has been able to answer. You are left looking at an argument and a conclusion, with no visible middle to connect them. The prosecution's opening statement is worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells you exactly what kind of case the community was actually building. It does not argue mechanism or physics, nor does it try to establish how the clocks stopped, or prove that Vane had engineered them to do so through mechanical trickery. Instead, the state argues pattern and proximity. The prosecutor listed the dead by name, noted the clock connection for every single one, and then made a claim that was essentially theological in nature. He argued that a man who keeps no scripture, who measures the hours of the night with an obsessive precision, and who sells his instruments exclusively to the faithful, only for those instruments to mark the moment they die, has placed himself outside the protection of a Christian community. The legal theory rested on the Conjuration Statute, which in 1884 was already being called an embarrassing relic by lawyers in the cities of Lexington and Louisville. In the isolated courtrooms of Harlan County, it was apparently still sufficient to convict a man. The defense argument survives only through a brief account in the Harlan County Ledger, a newspaper whose coverage of the entire trial runs to 4 short paragraphs total. According to that report, Vane's counsel argued that the prosecution had confused correlation with cause, and he insisted that clocks stop and people die without sharing any hidden mechanism. He warned the jury that convicting a man for the behavior of a machine was an act the county would eventually regret once the fever of the moment broke. The Ledger's reporter summarized this entire defense in a single sentence before moving on, which suggests either that the argument made very little impression on the room, or that the reporter had already decided how this story was going to end. Vane did not testify during those 2 days, or, if he did, his words are among the sections that have vanished from history. The Ledger makes no mention of him speaking a single word in his own defense. Hargrove's record, which continues through the trial period, contains an entry for each day of the proceedings, but notes only the general atmosphere of the room rather than the substance of the testimony. On the second day, he wrote that the room was full to capacity, and that the verdict was received with general satisfaction and some weeping. That is the kind of detail that lands differently depending on who you imagine was crying in that courtroom and what they believed they had lost. The verdict came down as guilty of conjuration and malicious interference, and the judge handed down a sentence of 5 years in the state penitentiary at Frankfort. Vane was 52 years old at the time. He had arrived in the Hollow at 40, spent 12 years building clocks for people who distrusted him and needed him in equal measure. And then he left, in the back of a wagon, in February, with the temperature sitting well below freezing, and the ridgelines turned white with snow. He died in Frankfurt only 18 months later. The cause entered into the prison record is listed as pulmonary failure, which in 1884 was a category broad enough to contain tuberculosis, pneumonia, or simple institutional neglect. The prison at Frankfurt was not a place where the state invested in the survival of its inmates, and a 52-year-old man convicted on an archaic statute in a rural county was not the kind of prisoner anyone was tracking closely. The circuit court, acting before Vane's death and without any expectation that it needed to wait for an appeal, ordered the clocks destroyed. Most of the congregation complied immediately. They took the clocks off their parlor walls and burned them in public, and the court recorded this as a successful execution of its order, which was supposed to be the end of the matter. It wasn't. Most of the clocks were burned, and since the court record says so, there is no particular reason to doubt the destruction took place. People who had watched 5 of their neighbors die while a clock ticked in the next room were not sentimental about the furniture in their homes. They stacked the wooden cases in the churchyard and put fire to them, standing there in the cold, until the walnut and cherry and the brass gears inside all turned the same color of ash. The court called it compliance, but the congregation likely felt something much closer to a sense of relief. But 3 clocks didn't burn. How they survived is a different question for each one, and the answers get thinner the further back you try to trace their paths. What is certain is that by the early 20th century, at least 3 Vane clocks had made it out of the Hollow intact, by passing through estate sales and the quiet, informal commerce of people who either didn't know what they had or knew exactly what they had and chose to keep quiet. The first clock surfaced in Lexington within a private collection assembled by a merchant family who acquired the piece sometime before 1910. The family's records do not document where the clock came from or who sold it to them. By 1967, the collection had passed to a grandson who allowed a horologist named Raymond Cutler to examine several of the family's more unusual pieces. Cutler's written assessment of the Vane clock is 3 pages, typed on university letterhead, and it describes a movement that was unlike anything he had ever encountered in American clockmaking from that period. He noted the hand-cut gears and the unusual geometry of the escapement, and then he added a technical observation that stops the document cold. He wrote that the escapement appeared deliberately calibrated to introduce periodic stopping, meaning the fault was not an accident of the design, but a structural part of it. Reproducing that specific effect would require a clockmaker with both the skill to build a machine correctly and the dark intention to build it wrong. Cutler did not speculate about what that intention might have been, as he simply stated what he found and signed his name to the bottom of the page. That letter is the closest thing this case has to physical evidence that Vane actually engineered the stoppings. It is one man's assessment, written 53 years after the trial, on a clock that may or may not be representative of the others Vane built. It is not nothing, but it is also not enough to close the question for good. The second clock went to a county historical society in the 1940s, donated by a family who gave no explanation for why they had kept it for 60 years, or why they were finally giving it up. The society photographed the piece before accepting it into their collection, and those photographs still survive today. The back of the case is visible in 2 of the shots, and the symbols etched into the wood match the descriptions in Hargrove's record with a chilling precision. They are the same marks, with the same strange spacing. The Historical Society eventually sold the clock in the early 1960s to cover their operating costs, and the buyer's name was never recorded in a way that anyone has been able to trace. The third clock has no documented location at all after 1901, which is when it appeared in a handwritten inventory of a deceased farmer's estate just outside the hollow. The inventory noted a clock of unusual make that was valued at only $2. After that entry, there is nothing. There is no sale record and no subsequent mention in any archive that researchers have been able to check. It passed out of the paper record the way objects do when nobody thinks they matter, or perhaps when someone decides they shouldn't be found by the public. That clock is still unaccounted for. If you go looking for Elias Vane in the standard Kentucky historical record, you will find absolutely nothing. He is missing from the county histories published at the turn of the century, absent from the Baptist church registers surviving from Harlan Hollow, and ignored by the commemorative volumes that Eastern Kentucky townships produced to celebrate their founding families. Even though he ran a business in that hollow for 12 years and eventually died in a state prison, he left no official trace that anyone deemed worth preserving. This kind of total erasure is rarely an accident, as it is usually what a community does when the alternative is explaining itself to the world. What actually survived did so almost in spite of the people involved in the case. The Hargrove record is the single document that makes this entire story reconstructible, yet it stayed tucked away in his family for over 100 years before a descendant finally donated it to a university archive in the 1990s. For years after that, the papers sat uncatalogued and unsearchable under a miscellaneous county heading, until a researcher working on a completely different project about Appalachian legal history pulled the file by mistake. That tiny margin of error is the only reason this story exists for us to tell today. The conjuration statute used to put Vane in prison was finally repealed in 1891, which was 7 years after his conviction. The legislature did not strike the law because of his specific case, and there is no record of his name ever being mentioned during the floor debates. It was removed because the state was trying to modernize its legal code, and the statute had become an embarrassment, serving as a dusty holdover from a time when the law believed a person could be criminally liable for working magic. Just 9 years after Margaret Mott's clock stopped ticking, the very thing Vane was convicted of doing ceased to be a crime. But he had already been dead for 3 years by then. You have to consider what the town was doing when they ordered those clocks to be burned. They were destroying the primary physical evidence in a case that rested entirely on how those physical objects behaved. Because a court ordered that burning, it was not technically a mob action, but rather a judicial instruction to eliminate the only things that could have been examined by an expert. This order came down before anyone with the right skills was given a chance to look at the mechanisms. And Cutler's 1967 assessment of the surviving Lexington clock shows exactly what a trained eye might have discovered. The town simply made sure there would be nothing left to see. Vane was not the only person in Appalachian history to be prosecuted under these strange conjuration statutes. This legal mechanism was used across the region throughout the late 19th century, and it was almost always turned against people who lived like he did. These were skilled, isolated men who lived outside the local congregation and therefore lacked the protections that a church extended to its own members. His case is only better documented than the others because Hargrove kept writing things down, even when those details complicated his own legal argument. There is a deep irony in the fact that the man who built the prosecution also built the archive that makes the trial look like a sham. Hargrove never seems to have considered that possibility during his life, or, if he did, he never let his pen record the thought. The clocks stopped, and people died. A man was convicted on a law the state threw out 7 years later, and he died in a cold prison cell before anyone with the knowledge to understand his work could get close to him. The town burned the evidence and called it justice. And whatever Elias Vane actually knew about those machines, he kept it to himself until the very end. The third clock is still out there somewhere, perhaps sitting in an attic, a barn, or a dealer's back room. Nobody knows if the gears are still moving. Subscribe for more buried histories from the Hollows, and share this story with someone who would want to know it existed.